what language did the Buddha speak? That's pretty basic. Now, if you ask a pious Theravada Buddhist today, if you ask one of my neighbors in Thailand, they'll be eager and quick to reply, he spoke Pali. And for them, the name Magadhi, the language of the Magadha area where he lived and did most of his teaching, is a synonym for Pali. In other words, they understand the two to be equivalent. But as we shall see, things are certainly not so simple. To begin with what we do know, it's well established that the Buddha lived in the northeastern part of the Indian subcontinent, having been born in what today is southern Nepal, and that he spent most of his teaching career in the region known as Magadha. So it does seem reasonable to suppose, as specialists do, that most of his teachings were initially delivered in some form of what more technically is called Old Magadhi, and it's referred to as Old to distinguish it from Ardha Magadhi, a much later language that was used for the transmission of scriptures belonging to the Jain tradition. But Old Magadhi was far from the only language spoken in India, or even in northern India at the time. And it seems likely that the Buddha may have been able to communicate in more than one language. And there were many other languages that scholars refer to as Prakrits. This is the first term on your handout here. It's a term that's used to refer to vernacular, that is spoken Middle Indic languages. Prakrita can be defined as natural or unrefined, or we might even say unvarnished. Prakriti, of course, is a very famous word in Indian philosophy. And the contrast here is with Sanskrit, which is Samskrita, which is surely a word that you all know, but in different contexts. In this context, we might say it means put together, in the sense of almost decorated, made beautiful. Now, it sounds from that pair of terms as though what we're talking about is Prakrits being made into Sanskrit. And that did happen later in Indian Buddhist history. We have early texts composed in Prakrits. The oral teachings were surely in Prakrit languages, local vernaculars. And then over the course of time, again, I'm sure this is familiar to most or all of you, Sanskrit became more and more the language of choice for the transmission of Buddhist texts. So by the time the Tibetans received this tradition, Sanskrit appeared to be the normal Buddhist language. But things were much more diverse in the early period. And let me just call your attention to how weird this situation is. The Prakrits are the daughter languages of Sanskrit. So Sanskrit is older as a language, but newer as a language of transmission of Buddhist texts. There's something interestingly backward about what happened language-wise in the history of Indian Buddhism. So what I'm going to be talking about at the beginning of this talk are these offspring languages of Sanskrit, different types of Prakrits that were spoken in different parts of India. We can actually obtain some concrete information about what they were like from the inscriptions of King Ashoka, who had messages to his subjects, PR pieces, you could say, carved on stone and erected throughout his realm. They are in a variety of Prakrits. One of the most invaluable legacies of King Ashoka is that his inscriptions have allowed scholars to map out the variety of different Prakrits spoken on the Indian subcontinent during his time. So just staying with northern India, which is the area we're concerned with right now, it's possible to distinguish the linguistic and phonological features of Eastern versus Western Prakrits in the middle of the 3rd century. So back to my Theravadan friends. Where does Pali fit into this picture? It's certainly to be classified as one of the many Middle Indic languages, and thus, in a certain sense, it's a Prakrit. But when we map Pali onto the picture provided by the Ashokan inscriptions, we, or rather Indological specialists, discover something very peculiar. For Pali does not fit the normal profile of an ordinary Prakrit. Instead, as the great Pali scholar Oskar von Neuber has shown, it exhibits a mixture of Eastern and Western features. including some terminology that's thought to go back to Old Magadhi itself, even older language. The majority of the characteristics of Pali, in fact, line up with what we know from the inscriptions would be Western Prakrits, not Eastern. And this already would call into question whether it was anything close to the language the Buddha spoke, since the Buddha lived and taught in the eastern part of this region. It's clear that it was not the language the Buddha spoke. But not only did the Buddha not speak Pali, no one spoke Pali. Pali is, as von Hindenburg calls it, an artificial language, cobbled together from a variety of spoken languages to come up with what von Hindenburg called, I'm not sure it was the best choice, but he called it a lingua franca for the purpose of disseminating Buddhist teachings across dialectal or perhaps language lines. So it's a compromise language made up of pieces from different languages in India at the time. The reason I have trouble with lingua franca is usually that means something you can speak. Usually that it can be a marketplace language where people from different linguistic backgrounds can haggle over goods in some common tongue. And that's not what Pali was. It's a scriptural lingua franca. I don't think we really have a word for that. But used originally and only for religious texts. And I mean that broadly, not only for the canonical scriptures attributed to the Buddha, but later for commentaries and for what we might call church histories, texts like the Dipavamsa from the 3rd or 4th century, or the Mahavamsa from the 5th century, composed to tell the history of Buddhism and, of course, the history of Sri Lanka in the process, composed in Sri Lanka much later. So Pali is already representing a bit of a divergence from the language policy we talked about at the beginning. It's no one's language, and ideally everyone's language, at least as a language for the study and recitation of Buddhist texts. There's another rather surprising implication of this, maybe even shocking to some people, and that is that the texts in Pali cannot in any sense be described as the originals. When I say shocking to some people, I mean, again, a lot of my Theravadan friends who consider this the real Buddha Vachana. This is what he said, and it's in the language that he said it. That would be nice. We have no podcasts, alas, from the Buddha. But in terms of a conference devoted to translation, what this means is the texts in Pali are not original teachings in anyone's dialect. They are translations, or at least transpositions into different wording using various Prakrit elements. The word Pali is the subject of a very old misunderstanding, not ours. We inherited it. This is a misunderstanding in medieval Asian traditions. The word doesn't appear in the Pali Tripitaka. It's a commentarial word. It comes from a later layer of Buddhist literature. And when it does appear, it's the phrase that it appears in is Pali Bhasa. Well, you know Pasha, Subhashita, and so forth. Just the Pali language. So it looks like the name of a language, like the French language, or the Sanskrit language, or the Chinese language. But it's not. Pali, as I think some of you already know, doesn't mean a language name. It means texts. Specifically, it means scriptural religious texts.